This is Metro Week. Our top story, solar power in Arizona. We'll see why people are putting solar panels on their rooftops. Then we'll find out about research into solar power production. Plus, our Journalists Roundtable analyzes the week's news.
Welcome to Metro Week. I'm Andrea Kelly. Arizona's sun beats down on the rooftop of every house in the state. For the last decade, people living under those rooftops have increasingly taken advantage of the solar bath by installing collection panels that turn sunlight into electricity. Reporter Vanessa Barchfield visits a Phoenix suburb that has gone solar in a big way.
In most ways, Pebble Creek is your totally quintessential Arizona retirement community. Just a few minutes off I-10 in the Phoenix suburb of Goodyear, the development's roads wind past sand-colored stucco homes that all pretty much look the same. Retirees in shorts and visors tee off on rolling golf courses. There are games of pickleball, fluffy dogs on leashes, and golf carts are a main form of transportation. But there is one thing that sets this community apart.
Pebble Creek has 4,359 houses, and 1,002 of those houses have rooftop solar.
Bacon says Pebble Creek has one of the highest solar installation rates in the state. He and his wife Regina were among the first people in the community to put up solar panels in 2008.
A large part of the thing that made me want to do it was the need that I see for the world to decarbonize our power system and our energy usage.
During his career, Bacon worked in the chemical industry. He says seeing the damage pollution causes firsthand transformed him into an environmentalist, a passion he says most of his neighbors don't share. But to drum up some enthusiasm for issues he cared about, Bacon founded an environment club at Pebble Creek. It was there that word about rooftop solar started to spread.
Shortly after forming the club, we had two friends that put solar on their house. And so I invited them as our next speakers. And we had been having 12 or 15 people come to our meetings. And with the solar meeting, the first solar meeting, we had 89 people.
Bacon says most of his neighbors were interested in solar not because they cared about climate change. Instead, solar enticed them for the same reason it did Earl Adamy.
It was a financial decision. I think it makes sense to make as much use of the sun as we can. But it was a dollar and cents decision, and it made sense. I've got some tucked back on this roof.
Adamy, who's from Wichita, Kansas, conducted a thorough financial analysis before deciding to invest in solar.
I went through my APS bills, put in to a spreadsheet what my use had been, got the PV watts data to estimate the output.
While many Pebble Creek residents were opting to lease solar systems, Adamy chose to buy his outright.
I didn't want someone else owning part of my house, so to speak.
Finances are a major reason that Pebble Creek residents have installed solar.
Hello, I'm Shirley Smith.
Smith moved to Pebble Creek from Portland, Oregon with her late husband. She says her summertime electric bills, which reached upwards of $300, were just too high.
I couldn't handle it. On a fixed income, you just can't do that. And I didn't want to move from here, so I talked to several people that were involved in solar and realized that this would be the way for me to go.
Smith leases her system, and she says her bills have dropped considerably. She says she pays about $110 every month to lease her system.
Even with the price of leasing, I still save money.
Before moving to sunny Pebble Creek, even before solar technology took off, Smith says she and her husband were already using the power of the sun.
We had solar to heat a swimming pool in Portland, Oregon. And even under the gray skies, it heated a huge swimming pool. And so when we moved here, we thought solar would be the answer.
Smith says that when panels started popping up on houses around her neighborhood, she thought they were kind of ugly.
And I thought, gosh, are we going to have to look at that like we used to have to look at the big air conditioning units on people's roofs? But it's different. It blends better.
You reach a point where they're all over the place and you don't notice them anymore.
Charles Mackerly describes himself as a non-practicing lawyer. He's one of the community's experts on energy policy and says he's closely following proposals that utilities have made to the Corporation Commission to change net metering rates. When a house with solar panels produces more power than its occupants consume, that power is pumped back into the grid, and in return, the utility actually pays the homeowner. Mackerly says he thinks it's fair that utilities charge solar customers a small fee since they are using the utility's administration and infrastructure. However, he thinks Arizona's largest utility, Arizona Public Service, or APS, is trying to discourage rooftop solar in order to maintain its monopoly.
An issue that nobody focuses on is, are we partners with APS to provide electricity to my neighbors, or are we competitors?
He says he thinks APS looks at him and other solar customers as competitors.
I think the better approach is to look at it as a partnership. That makes it very simple.
Whether APS sees it that way is too early to say. In the meantime, more solar panels are going up on Pebble Creek rooftops all the time. Resident Drew Bacon, who founded the Environmental Club, says one reason the installation rate is so high is that people in Pebble Creek talk to each other a lot. In the early days, most people would direct their questions about solar to him.
For a while, after we started putting solar on here, I had over 1,000 emails in about 4 or 5 months.
Those questions have slowed substantially, although he still sees more and more panels going up all the time.
And what I found out is they weren't coming to me with questions anymore. They were going to their neighbor. Like the neighbor across the back fence was saying, here's what I did and here's the company I used and they did a good job and those kind of things.
Thanks in a large part to those conversations, about 1 in every 4 Pebble Creek houses uses solar, and that number is growing steadily. Bacon says that makes him and his neighbors role models for homeowners around the state, which could make the sunniest place in the nation also the most solar-powered state.
Efforts continue to improve solar technology. Manufacturers want to improve the photovoltaic panels that capture the sun's energy to create usable power. I interviewed a University of Arizona researcher about her work with solar panels. We're here at a testing site where you do your research into solar energy. What are you studying here?
Now, we look at a bunch of different things. The big thing that we look at, though, is how different modules degrade with time. So the way in which a module fails in the field is going to be very different in Arizona than it might be in somewhere else, like in the Pacific Northwest or in Florida. So we look at a lot of different degradation modes. We also compare different modules side by side to help give an idea of which modules perform better in the desert. And then there's a few other smaller projects that companies may ask us to do, such as looking at how soiling affects modules. So things like that.
How many different types of modules do you have out here?
We have about 24 types out here.
And they're all being studied simultaneously?
That's right.
And is it comparative studies or are they individual projects?
A little bit of both. So it started as a comparative study. So everything out here has data being recorded on it, so we can go back and do background analysis or historic analysis and do comparative studies. And then we have some isolated projects that manufacturers may come out and ask us to do individually.
Describe how you actually do your research, what the process is.
Okay. So when a manufacturer or some type of company comes to us and says, we want to look at, for example, anti-soiling coating, we say, all right, and we get an idea of what their budget is and we try to figure out exactly what that experiment will look like. So then do we need one set of panels? Do we need the whole yard? How do we design that experiment? Once we have that figured out, we go in and we instrument everything. So depending on what types of measurements we need. And then if we need new personnel, we might hire some incoming students or grad students, which is really fun to get to train new people. And then we set up the experiment and just make sure everything runs for however long we need. Sometimes that's a week, usually that's more like a year. And then we start doing all the data analysis, data crunching after the process is over, and then submit reports to the company, and then also TEP may ask to see the same reports because they like to know what's going on out here as well.
So you're a U of A employee and researcher. We're on Tucson Electric Power property. What's that relationship?
Yeah, so Tucson Electric Power started this yard in 2003 when a lot of homeowners decided they want to start putting solar on their house. TEP was really curious, what's that going to do to our grid? So they actually started this yard as kind of a pilot to see what's going to happen when we put a lot of residential solar on the grid. But then after a few years, when they started to understand what was happening with the grid, they brought in the university as like, hey, we've got all these great resources. We don't really have the brain power to do the research on it. Will you guys take over? So we kind of run the operations and maintenance of making sure that everything's up and running and then doing all the research activities. And they're here to help provide funding if we need it, and also the space and the technical electrician personnel that we need.
Are these panels actually connected to the TEP grid?
Everything out here is connected.
And how does the technology actually work in layman's terms for those of us who haven't studied it for years and years?
Yeah, so if you think of an atom and there's electrons that are spinning around that atom, some of those are very loosely bound to that atom. So they're connected, they're around the atom, but they don't really have much function. So they're ready to go. So as soon as a photon or a solar ray comes into the PV panel, if it has the same energy as that electron that's spinning around the atom, it can bounce that electron off, it can free that electron from its bond. And then that's where the kind of magic of the solar panel comes in, is then we have this electric grid on top, or these metal lines on top that kind of whisk those free electrons away and then into the power grid to help power all of your appliances, and then it comes back through the grid system.
Is your research based on actually coming out here and studying physical condition of the panels, and also then the energy production via data?
Yeah, we look at the energy production and how that changes with time. We're not as concerned about what's happening within the materials, although we can compare different types of materials. We do have lots of different types of materials out here. But instead of looking at the physics of the materials, we're more looking at how does that translate into electricity in the long run.
Degradation of electrical power creation. Okay. And then you're studying this in the desert, in this dry environment, but you mentioned differences in other environments. So how do you know comparatively? Are there other sites like this around the country?
There are a few other test sites all around the country, and work's been done at the national laboratory level. So Sandia National Labs is doing a lot of work on this. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory is doing a lot of work trying to pull together their data from these different test sites to really help compare how systems are breaking down and to get a large database together of what's happening all across the country and even across the world with different test sites.
Now, this is a fairly small site compared to some of the other ones in the metro area, at the wastewater plant, on Davis-Monthan Air Force Base.
Right.
What about the impact of the sites themselves? Are you studying that?
Yeah, so the larger sites usually are just for utility production. So it's not for research, they just care about getting electricity on the grid. There are a couple of larger sites where they are doing research, like at the Arizona Tech Park, which is only a few miles from here. And at the Tech Park, they're looking at larger scale, like grid integration system research. So what happens if we put 10 megawatts of battery in conjunction with solar energy? Then how does that change the way that the electricity affects the grid? So those the idea of bigger projects that are happening out there. But a lot of those larger sites that you see around the metro area are not for research, they're just for energy production.
What else do people ask you about when you're out here doing research?
Well, a couple of questions I get when people find out that I'm doing solar energy research is, do I need batteries for my house? And that's becoming a much bigger one now, especially with Tesla. Some other questions, do I need to clean them? Why don't we have solar everywhere? So do we need to clean them? And in Tucson, the answer is no. We don't get enough dust for it to really be a big deal. And the rains, even though they only come once or twice a year, they do a pretty good job of cleaning them off. We've seen at most like a 1% efficiency drop as a result of soil on the front. So it's not a big deal. In terms of batteries, if you're grid connected, I would say no, you don't need batteries. If you think of the grid as your battery, then there's no reason to go and install chemical batteries for your house. If you were in a rural area, or if you were concerned about power outages, then maybe you would want to consider batteries. But if you're just grid connected and you just want to offset your carbon use, then there's no real reason to have the batteries. They don't serve a good purpose in that case. So there's lots of technological reasons for that, but mostly they're all political reasons as to why we don't have more solar. For the technological reasons is that right now we're used to being able to use electricity whenever we want it, right? So we turn on our switch or we turn on our air conditioner and we expect it to work. But with solar, we're limited to when the sun is out, right? So trying to meld in the electricity grid both these variable resources like solar and wind with the coal fire plant behind us, in that case where you can operate whenever the heck we tell it to operate, right? So trying to combine those two types of electricity can provide some issues on the grid with voltage fluctuations or frequency fluctuations. So that's when you get light flicker, when you get brownouts, is when you're trying to mix these two different types of resources. So those are some technological issues where you look at batteries in that case, or some other type of storage to smooth out those grid fluctuations.
The U.S. Supreme Court upheld a key provision of the Affordable Care Act. The ruling has direct effects on Arizona.
pretty close to 500,000 people in Arizona are getting covered in some way by the Affordable Care Act. And those over 200,000 don't need to worry about their premiums spinning out of control or spiking in any way because of an adverse ruling.
Now our Journalist Roundtable. Joining me in the studio this week are Dylan Smith of the Tucson Sentinel and my colleague here at Arizona Public Media, Zach Ziegler. Thanks to you both. Zach, in Vanessa's story, we heard how Arizona Public Service is dealing with its solar buyback program, and I wanted to ask you how Tucson Electric Power is handling that.
Well, Tucson Electric Power's rates have been a little more on the side of solar users or rooftop solar users, although they have been trying to institute some changes. They recently asked the Arizona Corporation Commission to make a change to the rate that they were paying. That ended up falling through. Now they're talking about turning this into an issue in their 2017 rate case.
So how is that all working in terms of what the request means and when a decision is made and what it means to a homeowner?
Well, the tricky thing for what it means to a homeowner and also for what it means for the solar industry right now is that this TEP is asking that this change be made retroactive to the date of their original request of June 1st, 2015. So there would be at least kind of this year and a half limbo where a solar installer, a person who's thinking about buying solar panels, couldn't really get a good idea of what their payback rate is going to be, how much they will be recouping, and also how long it would take them to pay off the purchase of solar panels.
And we typically see companies asking for things to happen in the future, not a request that's made that would impact customers who may have already made decisions, right?
Yeah, well, they always come to the future, but sometimes there are retroactive requests. I mean, this last request it wasn't decided, or TEP didn't pull back until after the June 1st date. So there was a point at which people who could have kind of had a moment where they got their solar panels installed, but still wouldn't have been grandfathered in.
Right now, there really isn't a complete proposal on the table from TEP, so people really don't have any idea if they were to invest in solar right now, what that payback rate would be, how much that they would get paid for the solar that they're putting in, what sort of charges might come along with it.
Yeah, it's all very speculative at this point, and TEP has just said, we are planning to do this in our next rate case. They have not put out the information as to what they will be asking for at this point in time yet. They're just saying we plan on bringing this back up, and we will be asking for it retroactive to the middle of 2015.
And I just want to clarify what we're actually talking about here, which is, and Vanessa mentioned it in her story, but we're talking about the rate that someone with solar on their rooftop gets paid back from TEP when they produce excess energy. So when they create solar energy that they're not using, TEP buys it, and what amount, how does TEP pay for that?
Especially if you're not running your air conditioner full blast in the middle of summer, like so many of us are right now. Generally, your rooftop solar during the day, especially if you're off at work, produces a lot more electricity than you're actually using in your house, so that gets fed into the grid, and you get paid a little bit from the utility for that.
And TEP can use that then to send power to offices which are using electricity during the day.
Yes, but what they are proposing at this point, how they have put it is, we basically they just want to pay what they pay to a larger scale solar provider. So their whole point is they have kind of they have up until now been treating this as an incentive program, but they feel that it has caught on enough that they can end the incentive program and just have people pay what they basically be paid what TEP, the company, pays to solar providers.
That does say a little bit about the increasing popularity of rooftop solar, the fact that you have a utility that's getting a little bit worried about how this is affecting their profit margin at this point. It's no longer just a little sideline. It's still very much a fraction of the electricity that gets produced, but it's something that, looking ahead, they're concerned about.
Dylan, what do you think about this in terms of where we are in the world? We have more than 300 days, and that's a low number that I just threw out of sunshine. And now we have a company that is maybe getting worried about what it's getting out of this. Where should we be on this?
Well, it would be nice if the U.S. and especially here in Arizona were anywhere near where, say, Germany is, or especially Spain, who those countries are really leading in solar. Go, look at how many cloudy days you have in Germany. Quite a few, and yet they have a greater percentage of their electricity coming from the sun than we do here in Arizona. That's doesn't quite seem like it should pencil out. As to why we're so far behind, or many reasons for that. We haven't really seen these sort of government incentives in a way that other countries have done to encourage that. So whether that's a good investment for the government to do, or whether we should sort of stay on the path that we're on now, you could make a pretty good argument for both ways, because solar is starting to progress. But really, the big question here in Tucson is why we don't have more research and development and companies actually here building solar products. It's still a pretty small segment of our economy, and it's something that we could be, just given the amount of sun that comes on us every year, every day, especially now, that there's a huge opportunity there that I think we're missing out on as to revitalize our local economy.
Meanwhile, almost every week on this show, we have the topic of economic development ripe for the discussion. So. Yeah. There's an opportunity.
And this is something that Bruce Wright at the U of A Tech Park has talked extensively about. Is it's great to be the main point of generating. It's great to be a place where it's being produced, but a real economic drive can be gotten from being on that research and development side.
That's something that could actually bring outside money into Tucson and help, build our economy instead of some very small scale things that are happening here. Other people in other places could be paying people who work in Tucson for what's going to go on their rooftops.
I want to switch to another topic that both of you have been covering this week, and that is the F-16 crash that happened near Douglas, Arizona. Zach, what do we know so far?
Well, so far, the last release that came out, keep in mind, I'm going entirely off of what the 162nd Wing of the Arizona Air National Guard and what the Cochise County sheriffs have said at this point. What they have said is that the pilot was an Iraqi brigadier general, Rashid Mohammed Sadiq Hassan. He did perish in the crash. The fire that was started at the scene was put out. There was no damage to the nearby high-powered gas lines. One family was evacuated as a result of the crash, and that's most of the details we know at this point. We also know it was an Iraqi plane. They had previously been training in American planes, but now they are moving on to their own.
So Iraqi pilot in an Iraqi-owned plane. Dylan, did we see any concern that this might have been, something that was not approved or something there should be questionable?
Well, it was a training mission. It's fairly common for pilots from other countries to train here in Tucson, not just from Iraq. There's a contingent of Iraqi pilots training here, but we train pilots from Singapore and Oman and a lot of the NATO countries, and Norway and Denmark and Belgium and the Netherlands.
NATO and U.S. allies,
It's very common for those pilots to be here training because Tucson's such a great place to train. So exactly what happened to cause this plane to go down is at this point, very much unclear. The Air Force says they're going to investigate, of course, but it did cause an enormous fire. There was several hundred yards wide, about a quarter of a mile long where this plane went down. So there was really a lot to deal with for the emergency responders to even get to the point where they could get up and examine the wreckage and find the pilot.
And at this point, there have not been any wildfires that sparked from that, correct? I mean, we don't have this massive other thing happening now.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, they managed firefighters on the scene. Multiple different units came out, put out the fire, and it was extinguished by 9 o'clock Thursday morning, from what I was told.
And this happened Wednesday night. So we know that they're investigating the cause. Anything else we're still waiting to learn?
I think it's down to the series of incidents that led up to it, whether it was a pilot error, which we've seen before in some of the crashes in southern Arizona, whether it was equipment malfunction. It's really unknown.
Dylan, I'm going to shift topics again on you, and we're going to talk about the Affordable Care Act decision that the Supreme Court made this week, saying that people who live in states, including Arizona, who do not have a state-run marketplace or exchange to buy that insurance on, are still eligible to get the federal subsidies to help lower the cost of their health insurance. What does this mean, other than that Arizonans get to keep their insurance? What does this mean for Arizona?
Well, there are, a lot of people in Arizona who are relying on those subsidies to maintain their health insurance. This wasn't something that was going to end people's health insurance, but it would have taken away the subsidies, and for quite a number of people would have made it very unaffordable. For others, I have my wife and I have an Obamacare plan, and it wouldn't have affected us all that much. It certainly would have been a little bit more money every month out of our pocketbook, but we're not, so far down the income ladder that we completely depend on those subsidies to keep our health insurance going. But for a lot of people, they do. And for them, for those folks, that's pretty good news coming out of the Supreme Court, I think.
And how do Pima County's rates compare nationally?
Well, that's one of the curious things, is that Pima County, for whatever reason, was judged. I guess we're healthy enough here in Pima County that the insurance companies gave us some pretty favorable rates. We have some of the most affordable Obamacare marketplace rates in the nation here.
So that could mean less subsidies or lower dollar amounts of subsidies
Yes.
here. Okay. Zach, we've been talking also a lot on this show about the possibility of a recall election in Oro Valley. Something happened this week, so I want you to just bring us up to speed on that story.
Yes, the signatures to recall Mayor Satish Hiremath were handed in to the Oro Valley town clerk. They now have, from now they have 9 days to process it, then it goes on to the Pima County Recorder's Office, where they have as much as 60 days, I believe, to get through and verify each independent signature. 3,500 were presented. They only require about 2,700. So that's a pretty good number. When I spoke with Ryan Hartung of the Oro Valley Citizens for Open Government, he said they used kind of the same formula they did when they recalled 3 town council members as far as how many signatures they wanted to gather. They were successful on that end. So we will see what is coming, though, with Mayor Hiremath.
So for sure, the 3 council members are facing a recall election in November. They can choose to run for re-election or they can not, and some other people could seek the seat. And we're just waiting for the signatures to be verified on the mayor.
Yes, and from what I've been told, there are a few names that are already being mentioned. When I spoke with Ryan Hartung, he said he is in the early stages of preparing to file and run in that election, as well as Cheryl Lamona, who was from the group Teed Off over tax hikes in Oro Valley. That was the initial group that tried to put the purchase of El Conquistador Country Club to a referendum. There's also one other person at this point who they're starting to work towards getting their names on the ballot.
So it looks like we could be seeing candidates that are coming out of the committees that initiated the recall.
Yes, yeah.
Is there any limit to the number of candidates who can try and run in this election? Will there be a primary to sort people out, or does everybody run in the general?
I'm not entirely sure how.
Because it could be a free-for-all if enough people start trying to throw their names in.
It could turn into that lovely California gubernatorial election that we saw when Gray Davis was removed. Yeah.
And the point of contention is all over the purchase of El Conquistador, right?
Yes.
That's what's really set this off.
Yeah. The groups have said it's not even so much. Some people have said it was over the tax hikes. Others, such as Hartung, have said it was more about the fact that the process was pushed through so quickly and they felt like they didn't have a chance to get their voice out there.
And have no fear, we will answer that question in a future show as we get closer to all of these elections. We're going to have
Probably haven't heard the end.
Yes. Tucson elections, the Pima County bond election, the Oro Valley recall election. There's more to come on Metro Week on those. Speaking of the bond election, though, Dylan, in our last minute or so, it's not a new topic, but we heard this week that Tucson City Councilman Steve Kozachik is concerned about maybe some of the ongoing costs of the projects. Can you tell us what he said?
Part of the bond is to require the other agencies or municipalities who receive the funds to pay for maintenance on these projects for a quarter of a century. And
if they don't?
The county's got a kind of a big stick. They said, potentially they could stop paying for other projects if they point out to some deficiency. If 10 years down the road, we find that, say Tucson is not paying the bill to maintain something, the county could step in and deal with it and send the city a bill.
All right, right, that's another topic we will keep watching. Thanks to you both as we sped through several topics today. I appreciate you coming in. As usual, all of the stories we produce at Arizona Public Media are available on our website. You can listen to stories and watch past episodes of this and other shows. Before we go, we want to mention that next week we will take a break and air some special Independence Day programming. And now, Arizona Week looks at the Arizona impact of this week's U.S. Supreme Court decisions.